Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I'm really glad you're here with us today.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in.
So to start off this deep dive, I want you to picture something. Just, imagine you've been working outside all day in the blazing sun.
Oh, man. I know that feeling. You get completely parched.
Right. You're sweating, you're exhausted, and you take a massive, thirsty gulp from a cup on the counter, expecting it to be filled with, like, ice-cold, refreshing water.
Oh, that's the best feeling.
But instead, and this is the worst, what hits the back of your throat is this tepid, stale concoction of heavy minerals, like water that has just been sitting out baking in the sun for days.
Ugh, gross.
Yeah, your immediate involuntary reflex is to gag. You just want to spit it out, right?
Spot on. You can't even help it.
Well, for roughly 2,000 years, modern readers have looked at the famous lukewarm church in the Bible and assumed it was a warning about losing your emotional passion.
Yeah, we read it as this critique of people who just aren't feeling excited enough about their faith.
But the stack of sources we're looking at today argues that this passage has absolutely nothing to do with emotional fervor.
Wait, really? Nothing at all?
Nothing. The scholars point out it is actually about ancient Roman city planning, the physics of stone aqueducts, and, the chemistry of mineral springs.
That's a huge shift.
It is. And missing that historical context changes the entire meaning of the text. So our mission for this deep dive is massive. We are going to look at the hidden baggage that you, sitting there listening right now, might be bringing to your reading of ancient texts.
Yeah, because we all have blinders. We just don't realize it.
Precisely. We're drawing from a stack of commentaries and historical analyses to identify and strip away these cultural blinders, specifically modern Western post-Enlightenment assumptions.
Right, because those assumptions prevent us from seeing the actual historical and grammatical meaning.
So we're going to unpack three highly familiar passages today from Revelation, Luke, and 1 Timothy. The sources argue that when we read these texts through a modern lens, it completely alters the intended meaning.
It's a fascinating problem to unpack. The authors of these materials suggest a really helpful way to think about this.
Oh, the software metaphor. I love this one.
Yeah, so reading an ancient text with a modern mindset is a lot like trying to run modern software on a 2,000-year-old operating system.
Right, or vice versa.
Yeah. The code itself is perfectly fine, but the system misinterprets the commands because the background architecture is just completely different.
Because we like things to be straightforward,
We do. We assume that because we can read the English words on the page, we automatically grasp the context behind them. But the framework we have to establish right from the start, according to the historical and theological sources we're reviewing, is that faithful reading requires submitting to the text's original environment.
Submitting to it. Yeah, not overriding it.
Right. The reader has to submit to the grammar, the history, and the authorial intent of the ancient Near East and Greco-Roman worlds.
We can't just treat the text like a wax nose that we shape to fit our modern preferences.
No, the authors argue that God gave these texts in real languages, in real geographic places, during real historical moments. So to understand them, we have to pay really close attention to the specific world in which they were first spoken.
I really like that operating system metaphor. It gets right to the mechanics of the issue.
It really does.
Because, a modern operating system has all these background processes running constantly that you never even think about, like Wi-Fi searching or battery monitoring, clock syncing.
You never see them, but they run everything.
Yeah. In the modern West, our cultural operating system has its own background programs running. So what are some of those massive submerged Western traits that clash so violently with the ancient biblical world?
Well, according to the sociological and historical data in our sources, the most influential assumptions are the ones no one ever feels compelled to state out loud.
The things that just go without saying.
Right. In the modern West, our background programs consist of hyper-individualism, a fierce demand for egalitarianism, consumerism, and an obsession with emotional zeal.
Emotional zeal, that's a big one.
It is. And the sources note that the emotionalism actually stems largely from 19th century revivalism here in America.
Oh, interesting. So it was relatively recent.
Very recent. We naturally prize personal choice. We prize efficiency, privacy, and personal authenticity above almost everything else.
But the biblical cultures didn't run on that software at all.
Not even close. Their operating system ran on corporate identity, public honor and shame, strict family obligation, primogeniture, and communal memory.
So when an ancient text leaves a certain matter unstated because the original audience already knew it natively, We modern readers just rush in and fill that blank space with our own modern instincts.
Yes, and it causes massive glitches.
I can hear someone listening to this right now and asking a very grounding question, though.
Oh, what's that?
Well, looking at these theological sources, they hold to the doctrine of perspicuity, which is the historical Protestant belief in the clarity of Scripture.
Right, the clarity of the text.
So, if the text is supposed to be clear and sufficient for faith, why on earth do we need to know ancient Roman history to understand it? Like, does history overrule the text?
That's a huge question.
Because if I need a doctorate in ancient Mesopotamian agriculture to read a basic parable, that feels like a massive barrier for the average person.
That is a very common and, frankly, a very valid pushback. But the sources we're working from address this directly.
Okay, how do they reconcile it?
Well, the doctrine of perspicuity means that those things necessary for salvation are clear. The way of salvation is plain enough that anyone can understand it.
So the core message is accessible.
Right. However, the scholars point out that perspicuity does not mean every single passage is equally clear without study, nor does it mean we can just ignore the historical context.
Okay, so history plays a role, but what is that role?
The sources say historical context acts as a servant, not a master. It illuminates the grammar and the setting. It never sits in judgment over the truth of the text itself.
Ah, I see. It's a tool.
A vital tool. The argument here is that assuming a text penned thousands of years ago was written inside a 21st century mindset is actually a form of chronological snobbery.
Wow, chronological snobbery. That's a harsh way to put it, but it makes sense.
Yeah, it is a type of pride to assume the ancient authors thought just like we do. To really understand the message, we have to do the diligent work of grammatical and historical exegesis.
We have to sort of transport our minds into that specific geographical and covenantal setting.
Exactly. I mean, yes, spot on. We have to draw out the meaning that is actually there rather than projecting our own ideas onto it.
That makes a lot of sense. We aren't replacing a Western prejudice with an ancient prejudice. We're just trying to understand the original communication on its own terms.
Right, letting the text speak for itself.
So to see this software glitch in action, we have to look at a concrete example. We're going to travel to the Lycus Valley in ancient Asia Minor.
Oh, this is the Laodicea passage.
Yes, the nauseating reality of the lukewarm church in Revelation chapter 3. Let's look at the letter to the church at Laodicea.
This is one of the most famous warnings in the text. The quote is, "I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth."
I mean, most of us have probably heard a commentary or a speech on this at some
Oh,
point.
absolutely. It's everywhere.
And the modern Western reading immediately assumes a scale of emotional temperature.
Right, the thermometer of zeal.
Yeah. We think hot equals spiritual zeal-like. Someone who is fired up, passionate, and heavily involved.
And we think cold equals outright rebellion or maybe atheism, someone who has just turned their back completely.
And lukewarm equals a nominal attendee, someone who is just going through the motions, showing up on holidays, but not really invested.
So the logical conclusion we draw from that modern framework is that God actually prefers a hardened atheist to a struggling, mediocre believer.
Which is terrifying. We think the message is, I would rather you hate me than just be okay with me.
But the sources we are looking at argue that this interpretation makes absolutely no sense when you dig into the mechanics of the history.
None at all.
No, it makes no sense because it's historically completely backwards. The commentaries argue that this emotional interpretation is a direct product of our modern obsession with revivalistic traditions.
We're just reading our desire for emotional intensity back into the ancient text.
Yes. To understand what is actually being communicated to the Laodiceans, the historians tell us we have to look really closely at the geography and the civil engineering of the Lycus Valley.
Okay, so let's unpack that geography. What's going on in that valley?
Well, Laodicea was flanked by two very significant neighboring cities. To the north, you had Hierapolis.
And Hierapolis was famous for something specific, right?
Yes, it was famous throughout the ancient Roman world for its hot subterranean mineral springs.
Hot springs.
Yeah, the tectonic activity there heated the water, and it was heavily saturated with calcium carbonate. Those hot springs were sought after for their medicinal properties.
Like ancient physical therapy.
Exactly. Yes, precisely. People would travel from all over the empire to bathe in those waters for healing and therapy.
So in this ancient context, hot is good. Hot is therapeutic and useful.
Yes, hot is highly desirable. Now, to the southeast of Laodicea, you had the city of Colossae.
Okay, what was Colossae known for?
Colossae was situated near the snowmelt of Mount Cadmus, which provided cold, refreshing mountain springs.
Oh, that sounds
In
amazing.
the scorching Anatolian climate where the sun just beats down relentlessly, that cold water provided life-giving hydration.
So it was pure, crisp, essential for survival.
Right. So cold is also very good. Cold is refreshing and useful.
But Laodicea had a massive geographical flaw, didn't they?
They really did.
Despite all their wealth, they had a major infrastructure problem.
The archaeologists point out that Laodicea was an incredibly wealthy banking and urban center, but it lacked a stable indigenous water supply.
They didn't have their own hot springs,
Yeah.
and they didn't have their own cold mountain streams.
No, so they had to rely on Roman engineering. They piped their water in via long stone aqueducts.
And you really have to think about the physics of this.
You do. By the time the hot water from the region of Hierapolis or the cold water from the region of Colossae traversed those miles of exposed stone
This
aqueducts,
is baking in the sun.
yeah, absorbing the ambient temperature of the environment, it arrived in Laodicea in a completely altered state. It was tepid.
The specific Greek word used in the text here is kleros, right?
Yes, klearos, which means tepid or lukewarm. It is the only time this word appears in the entire New Testament.
And it wasn't just the temperature that was the problem. It was the chemistry of the water.
That is the key detail. Because of the heavy mineral content, specifically the calcium carbonate, when the water dropped to a lukewarm temperature, those minerals precipitated out.
So the water literally tasted foul.
It was disgusting. It was no longer hot enough to soothe aching muscles, and it was no longer cold enough to refresh a thirsty traveler.
In fact, historical records show that this specific tepid, mineral-heavy water was literally used as an emetic in the ancient medical world.
Doctors used it to induce vomiting.
Which brings us back to that gag reflex we talked about at the very beginning of the show.
Right.
If you just ran a marathon in the blazing sun, you want an ice-cold glass of water.
Or if you have muscle cramps, you want a therapeutic heat pack.
But if someone hands you a room temperature, stale cup of water that has been sitting on the counter for days,
Yeah.
full of heavy dissolved minerals,
Your body rejects it.
yeah, if you take a drink, your natural biological reflex is to spit it out. It's repulsive.
And that local, everyday reality for the citizens of Laodicea gives the metaphor its concrete, devastating force.
That's not abstract to them at all.
Not in the slightest. The exegetical sources break down the Greek grammatical structure to prove this point, actually.
Oh, let's look into the grammar.
So, the text says, I know your deeds. The phrase in Greek is oida suta erga. The scholars point out that the verb here is a perfect active indicative.
Okay, let's translate that grammatical jargon into everyday language for the listener.
Sure. It means it represents an action that is absolutely completed in the past with ongoing present results.
So it's like looking at a fully finalized spreadsheet.
Yes, a finalized audit. The speaker is not evaluating their hidden emotional feelings or their internal psychological zeal. The text is evaluating their objective outward usefulness.
Wait, let me make sure I'm tracking with this. So the text is basically saying, I know your works, and your works are completely useless.
Yes. The speaker is saying, I wish your actions were useful. I wish you were providing healing to the world around you, like the hot waters of Hierapolis.
Or, I wish you were providing refreshing truth, like the cold waters of Colossae.
Right. But instead, your works are as useless and nauseating as the tepid municipal water you drink every single day.
Wow, that reframes the entire passage.
It completely flips it.
It's not a complaint about a lack of emotional fervor. It is a critique of a community that has lost its distinctiveness.
They have become perfectly assimilated into the affluent culture around them to the point of being completely ineffective.
And speaking of that culture, the historical sources spent a lot of time on the idol of civic pride in Laodicea.
Oh, they were incredibly proud.
Yeah, the text hits them exactly where they feel the most secure. The Laodiceans are quoted as claiming, I am wealthy, I have prospered, and I need nothing.
The commentators note that the phrase, I need nothing, is basically practical atheism dressed up in religious clothing.
Practical atheism. Because they rely on their own wealth.
Right. Laodicea was a major hub of banking and commerce. The Roman orator Cicero even cashed massive letters of credit there.
So they're financially independent.
Very. They were also famous for a highly lucrative textile industry. They bred a specific type of raven black sheep.
Black sheep.
Yeah, and they produced a glossy, expensive black wool that was highly sought after in the fashion of the Roman elite.
So they had banking, they had high fashion.
And medicine. On top of that, they were renowned for their medical associations. They produced a specific Phrygian powder made from local volcanic tephra mixed with oil.
And that was used as an eye salve.
Yes,
Ah.
used across the empire to treat eye ailments. The church in this city had just absorbed the background operating system of self-sufficiency from its surrounding culture.
Their financial and material prosperity had become a veil.
A veil that completely hid their spiritual poverty.
And the text shatters that delusion. It systematically tears away their civic costume.
It really does.
The response to them is, you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked.
And the authors point out that this counters every single one of their civic boasts, point by point.
Oh, I see the parallels.
Yeah.
You think your massive banks make you wealthy? You are actually poor.
You think your famous black wool makes you dignified and fashionable? You are naked.
You think your medical schools and Phrygian eye salve give you clear vision? You are completely blind.
The theological sources describe this piling up of terms as a kind of pastoral shock therapy.
Pastoral shock therapy. I like that.
Yeah, the text isn't mildly adjusting their self-image, it is entirely demolishing it.
But the commentators also stress that we can't miss the grace in this severe rebuke.
Right, there is hope offered.
In verse 18, the speaker gives them counsel. They are commanded to buy refined gold, white garments, and salve for their eyes.
Now, since the text just established that they are completely spiritually bankrupt, this concept of buying can't mean earning merit through transactions.
They have no currency left.
None. The theologians link this back to the Hebrew scriptures, specifically Isaiah chapter 55.
Oh, where it talks about a gracious commerce.
Yes, where the thirsties are told to come and buy wine and milk without money and without cost.
Let's break down the mechanics of that. What does that mean practically for the Laodiceans? What are they actually receiving in this transaction?
The sources map it out very clearly. The refined gold points to true spiritual treasure, which contrasts with their failing banks.
Okay, and the garments.
The white garments represent an imputed righteousness and purity granted externally, which covers their shameful nakedness in contrast with their local black wool.
And finally, the eye salve points to true spiritual sight and illumination that they cannot manufacture in their local medical schools.
Spot on. The text doesn't tell them to search deeper within themselves. It doesn't tell them to manufacture more emotional heat.
Because they can't.
Right. It tells bankrupt people to receive from an external source the very goods they lack.
In fact, verse 19 explicitly states the motive. Those whom I love, I reprove and discipline.
The text argues that wounding their pride is an act of love. It's meant to prevent them from perishing in their comfortable delusion.
That is a fascinating historical reconstruction. So just as the Laodiceans were blinded by their affluent, self-sufficient culture, modern readers are blinded by our own culture of absolute self-reliance.
We really are.
We read these ancient texts and automatically assume we are the hero of the story, entirely in control of our own destiny.
Which leads us right into the next major software glitch the sources bring up.
Yeah, the illusion of self-reliance doesn't just mess up our reading of Revelation. The authors argue it completely distorts how we read the parables.
Specifically the parable of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15.
Let's dive into that. This is highlighted in our materials as one of the clearest examples of how Western individualism causes a misreading of the text.
Oh, definitely. When modern Western readers look at the story of the prodigal son, the sociologists note that we focus almost entirely on the young man's autonomy.
We focus on his free will.
His bad budgeting, his wild living, and his eventual autonomous decision to clean up his life and go home.
Right, we treat it like a moralistic tale about making better financial choices.
We really do. We think the turning point of the whole story is just a moment of psychological clarity where the son realizes he made a mistake.
I've been foolish. I should go back to my dad's house.
Yeah, but the commentaries argue that we completely gloss over a massive historical and textual mechanism that drives the entire plot.
What's the mechanism we miss?
We ignore the famine.
The famine.
Yes. The sources draw our attention to Luke 15.14, which says, "Now when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in that country, and he began to be impoverished."
The Greek phrase used here is limos ischira, right?
Yes, limos ischira. The scholars explain that the adjective implies a mighty, forceful, or severe strength.
To understand this, we have to look at the mechanics of an ancient agrarian economy.
In the 1st century Near East, a famine was not a minor inconvenience.
Right. We live in an era of global supply chains. If crops fail in one state, The grocery stores just import food from another country or another hemisphere.
We barely even notice it at the consumer level. But in the ancient world, a famine was a catastrophic, inescapable force.
If the rains failed, there was no backup plan.
None. There was no refrigeration, food simply disappeared, and people starved to death.
It was like a slow-moving natural disaster that you couldn't run away from.
There is a really striking anecdote in one of the sources from a Russian reader who had actually survived the brutal sieges and famines of the 20th century.
Oh, I read that part. It's intense.
Very. The author notes that when this Russian man reads the parable of the prodigal son, his eyes immediately lock onto that famine.
Because he knows what it means.
Yes, he instantly recognizes that the famine is the central mechanism of the story. It is the inescapable reality that breaks the young man.
But because we in the modern West live in such unprecedented affluence,
Our operating system just skips right over that detail.
we just view it as a bit of unfortunate background scenery.
And the theologians argue that skipping over the famine causes us to miss the heavy theological weight of the passage.
So what's the theological weight behind a famine?
Well, they point out that in the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, the word for famine is frequently associated with covenantal curses.
Ah, specifically from Deuteronomy chapter 28.
Yes. In that historical framework, a famine is not just bad weather. It is viewed as divine providence.
So it represents the external, sovereignly ordained crushing of a rebel.
Yes.
Wait, looking at these notes, I need to push back on this a bit, because this is where a modern reader really struggles.
Okay, what's the struggle?
If the commentary is arguing that the famine is an external force decreed by God to break the sun, how does the source reconcile that with personal responsibility?
That's the tension, isn't it?
Because to a modern ear, if an external force pushed him into the dirt, it sounds like he isn't really to blame, like he's just a victim of circumstance. Does this theological framework diminish the son's personal culpability for squandering his inheritance?
The sources address that exact tension, and they argue that the text presents a dual reality.
A dual reality. Okay, explain that.
The commentaries emphasize that the son is entirely culpable for his wicked rebellion. Asking for his inheritance early was historically a massive insult.
He was essentially telling his father, I wish you were dead.
Precisely. He is fully responsible for his licentiousness and for squandering the wealth. However, the theological argument is that the son's eventual turnaround required the relentless grace of an external force working through providence.
The son didn't merely hit rock bottom by random chance or by, realizing his math was wrong.
No, the text says he was driven into the dirt by an unconquerable external force, the famine, that exposed his total inability to save himself.
The theologians use this to illustrate the doctrine of total depravity, don't they?
They do. He is trapped in the pigsty, entirely destitute, and his own human willpower or wealth cannot cure the famine.
The famine creates an absolute, inescapable destitution.
So that the individual is forced to look outside himself for rescue.
He literally comes to the end of his own resources.
And the authors point out a really interesting detail in the Greek syntax regarding this, actually.
Oh, right, the syntax. Let's talk about that.
The commentators highlight the phrase, and he began to be impoverished. In the original Greek, this uses the middle voice.
To explain that, without getting bogged down in grammar for the listener, what does the middle voice do here?
The middle voice indicates that the subject is acting in a way that affects himself.
So he became the recipient of the absolute lack.
Yes, he participated in his own emptying. The text is preparing him for grace by showing that he has nothing left to offer.
And when he finally does turn back toward home, the sources point out the display of what they call irresistible grace.
Because the father doesn't wait for the son to clean himself up.
Right. The father sees him from a long way off, feels compassion, and runs to him.
Which was highly undignified for an elderly Middle Eastern patriarch.
Very undignified. Culturally, older men of status did not lift their robes and run.
No, but he embraces him before the son can even finish his rehearsed apology.
The father absorbs the shame of the running to protect the son from the shame of the village. That is incredibly moving.
It is. But the sources also argue we have to look at the broader literary context of this parable.
Because Jesus didn't just tell this story in a vacuum to a general audience.
No, to understand the software, we have to look at who is actually standing there listening.
The historical context is explicitly given in the first 2 verses of Luke chapter 15, right?
Yes, the text notes that the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen. But the Pharisees and the scribes began to grumble.
They were saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them.
And the commentators point out that the entire chapter is a response to that specific grumbling.
So the speaker responds with a triad of parables: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son.
Which means the source material is framing this parable as a direct polemical attack on the self-righteous legalists in the crowd.
It's a targeted strike, not just a nice story.
Yes, the authors argue that the Pharisees are represented by the older brother in the parable.
One who stayed home.
Right. The older brother believed that his meticulous rule-keeping and his hard work merited the favor of the father.
So when the younger brother returns and the father throws a feast, the older brother refuses to go in.
He stands outside and grumbles.
The theological sources argue that the text is exposing a terrifying reality here.
And what's that?
That the older brother, who stayed near the house relying on his own works and his own merit, is just as lost and alienated from the father's heart as the younger brother who rebelled in a distant land.
The older brother fundamentally misunderstood the concept of unmerited favor.
He thought he could earn his seat at the table through his resume.
He did. And the commentaries point out that by isolating the prodigal son from this specific literary context, modern readers turn a devastating critique of works righteousness into a sentimental story about human willpower.
The authors argue that the parable is designed to strip the religious elites of their pride.
It forces them to see that rescue belongs entirely to the unmerited favor of the father.
The father who runs to the destitute person and clothes them without requiring them to earn it.
It's incredible how the background assumption of individualism causes readers to misread the mechanics of a parable.
We center ourselves, we center our free will, and we completely miss the sovereign providence of the famine and the polemical attack on the older brother.
But the sources point out that individualism isn't the only glitch in our modern operating system.
Oh no, there are more.
The authors argue that another massive Western trait egalitarianism causes readers to completely misread the letters of the early church.
Oh, let's get into this one. Let's look at the historical burden of the firstborn in 1 Timothy chapter 2.
The commentaries acknowledge that this is undeniably one of the most highly debated texts in the modern age.
It certainly is. In 1 Timothy 2.1-13, the text says, "But I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve."
The sources point out that the Western egalitarian mind reads that specific phrase, Adam was formed first, through a thoroughly modern meritocratic lens.
Because in our culture, when we hear the word first, we picture a foot race or a spelling bee.
Right. The person who crosses the finish line first is the winner.
They are deemed the fastest, the smartest, the strongest, or the most qualified.
So when modern people read Adam was formed first, the immediate assumption is that the text is making an argument that men are somehow inherently superior.
Smarter or more qualified than women.
And because that concept offends modern sensibilities, the authors note that many readers try to deconstruct the text.
Or they explain it away as just a localized cultural issue regarding uneducated women in the city of Ephesus.
But the historical scholars argue that reading first as a meritocratic victory completely ignores the legal and cultural mechanics of the ancient Near East.
Because that ancient world was governed by the law of primogeniture.
The historians explain that in that system, the firstborn son received the birthright and the double portion of the inheritance.
But crucially, that double portion was not just free money to spend on luxuries.
No, it came with the heavy, often terrifying mantle of covenantal headship over the extended family.
The firstborn was legally responsible for the debts of the family, the physical protection of the family, and the spiritual leadership of the family.
The authors stress that this status had absolutely nothing to do with inherent superiority, intelligence, or a resume of qualifications.
The sources use the biblical patriarchs as a prime example of this, right?
Yes, the commentaries point to figures like Esau and Jacob.
Esau was the biological firstborn. He was a strong man of the field.
But Jacob, the younger brother, was chosen as the man of promise.
The theological argument here is that the burden of leadership was assigned by divine decree,
not by biological superiority or a list of superior qualifications.
So according to the sources, when the text says Adam was formed first, it is not making a claim that Adam was smarter, stronger, or less prone to error than Eve.
It's pointing to the historical creational order.
It is saying Adam was assigned federal headship by a sovereign decree.
He was given the heavy responsibility to lead, to protect, and to teach, regardless of his personal qualifications.
That is the argument the authors are making. And the exegetical sources dive heavily into the specific Greek vocabulary to defend this position against modern critics.
Let's talk about the verb translated as exercise authority in this passage. The word is authentine.
Some modern critics argue that this word actually means to murder, to usurp, or to domineer. Right?
Yeah. Based on that definition, they claim the text is only forbidding abusive or violent leadership that was supposedly happening in the local Ephesian church.
However, the linguists in our source material have conducted exhaustive discourse analysis on this word.
Let's explain what discourse analysis actually is for the listener, because that sounds like a very dense academic term.
It's actually a very practical process. Discourse analysis involves scholars taking a specific Greek word and searching for it across thousands and thousands of extra-biblical ancient Greek texts.
Papyri, letters, legal documents, philosophical treatises.
Yeah, to see how ordinary people use the word in everyday life.
And the linguists argue that the data from this massive search shows that authentines simply means to exercise positive, lawful authority or to govern.
It does not carry an inherently negative or abusive connotation in this context.
Wait, I have to ask a question here based on the notes.
Sure, go ahead.
If the Greek word means positive authority, how does the source reconcile that with modern egalitarianism? Because to a modern ear, barring half the population from leadership doesn't sound positive at all. How do the authors explain the grammar working here?
The exegetical sources explain that the word is linked grammatically to the word for teaching.
Ah,
The Greek uses a correlative conjunction, oud, which translates to neither nor. It links the verb authentane to the verb ditskan, which means to teach.
the scholars argue that teaching the scriptures is universally recognized in the text as a positive, noble task.
Therefore, the grammatical rule dictates that the word it is linked to, authentane, must also refer to a positive, noble action.
The argument is that the text is establishing an ongoing, normative command regarding positive governance in the gathered assembly.
Furthermore, the commentators point out that the text grounds this command, not in the local culture of Ephesus.
And not in the pagan Artemis cult of that city either.
Right. It grounds it in the original creation narrative.
And the sources point out a specific grammatical tense regarding the creation narrative as well.
Yes. The linguists note that the verb aplastheia, translated as was formed, implies a completed action in the past.
To put it conversationally, the specific Greek grammar implies a one-and-done deal.
It is anchored in an unchangeable historical act, not a fluctuating cultural trend.
The authors argue that this is where modern readers really have to reboot their operating system.
The sources note that modern culture views submission and role distinctions primarily through the lens of power dynamics.
Who has the power, who is the oppressor, and who is the victim?
It is viewed as a zero-sum game.
But the theological commentaries argue that in the biblical worldview, this order is not an oppressive hierarchy.
It is a reflection of the Trinitarian economy.
The theologians explain the Trinitarian economy by pointing to the relationship between the Father and the Son in the text.
The Son joyfully submits to the will of the Father.
Even though the texts affirm they are entirely equal in essence, glory, and majesty.
The theological argument is that role distinction does not equal inequality of worth.
The sources suggest that filtering this ancient text through modern political theories completely distorts the intended structure.
The authors argue that what was intended to be a display of sacrificial headship and joyful submission is turned into a modern battleground over instinctual rights.
The authors of these notes argue that rejecting this framework isn't just a cultural disagreement about ancient customs.
They view it as a rejection of the original creational order described in the text.
The sources suggest that the modern egalitarian view demands that readers override the syntax of the Greek to appease contemporary sensibilities.
The argument is that faithful reading requires acknowledging the text design as authoritative, rather than modifying it to fit modern preferences.
That is the core thesis of the materials we are reviewing.
The sources repeatedly argue that the historical context and the grammatical structure must be allowed to speak.
Even when they clash violently with modern expectations.
So let's look at the underlying logical through line of these sources. We have discussed Laodicea's nauseating, mineral-heavy water.
And how wealth creates an illusion of self-reliance.
We then looked at how that illusion of self-reliance is shattered by the inescapable mechanism of a sovereign famine in the parable of the prodigal son.
And finally, we looked at how modern assumptions about merit and power distort the ancient concept of primogeniture and federal headship in 1 Timothy.
The authors of our materials do not leave these as three isolated historical facts.
No, they tie them all together.
They argue that all of these texts point to a single unifying focal point. How do the theologians tie all these threads together? Because we don't want to just offer a trivia lesson about ancient Roman aqueducts and Greek dictionaries.
The theological commentaries stress that if a reader just stops at the historical background, they have missed the primary purpose of the text.
The sources argue that every faithful reading must eventually lead to the central figure of the text.
Let's trace the arguments the authors make for all three passages.
Okay, starting with Revelation chapter 3.
In Revelation 3, the speaker introduces himself as the Amen, the faithful and true witness.
The theologians contrast this with the Laodicean church.
While the city was compromised, tepid, and useless in its witness, the central figure perfectly fulfilled the requirements.
The authors argue that when he offers them white garments, it represents an offer of imputed righteousness.
A covering that they cannot manufacture themselves, but must receive externally.
And what about the famine in Luke 15? The sources argue the famine reveals absolute destitution, but how does the commentary connect that to the central figure?
The theologians connect it by pointing to other texts where the central figure declares himself to be the true bread of life in the midst of spiritual famine.
The commentaries argue that he provides the sustenance that human wealth cannot buy.
Furthermore, the authors draw a stark contrast between the older brother in the parable and the central figure of the broader narrative.
The older brother refused to show grace and stayed outside grumbling.
The theological sources argue that the central figure is presented as the true and better older brother.
He did not stay in a place of privilege.
The text argues he entered into the cursed, distant land to lay down his life and bring his rebellious siblings back.
That is a fascinating parallel the authors draw. The older brother in the parable demands strict justice based on merit.
While the commentaries argue the true older brother absorbs the justice so the destitute younger brother can receive unmerited favor.
And how do the sources connect the concept of primogeniture in 1 Timothy to this central figure?
The theologians link 1 Timothy back to the broader biblical narrative regarding Adam.
The sources argue that the first Adam was the initial federal head, but he failed catastrophically, bringing ruin to the family.
The commentaries then point to texts like Colossians, which refer to the central figure as the prototokos,
A Greek word meaning the firstborn of all creation.
The theological argument is that he holds the ultimate rank of primogeniture.
The authors state that he perfectly executed the heavy burden of federal headship, securing the inheritance through his own obedience.
The sources suggest that the structure of the community is designed to visibly reflect that reality.
So what is the final takeaway the authors want the reader to grasp? We have spent all this time looking at how the sources clear away the debris of modern assumptions.
The primary challenge presented in these materials is that readers must stop using the ancient text as a mirror to reflect their own modern culture.
The authors argue that instead of trying to conform the text to contemporary sensitivities, the reader must allow the text to examine them.
The commentaries suggest approaching the material not as a critic trying to fix ancient words, but as someone trying to understand a communication that claims ultimate authority.
It really highlights the value of digging into the grammar and the history, rather than just reading the text at surface level.
The sources argue that when you actually understand the physics of the water aqueducts in the Lycus Valley,
When you grasp the catastrophic economic mechanics of an ancient agrarian famine,
and when you understand the terrifying burden of ancient primogeniture,
the text stops being a vague collection of inspirational quotes.
the authors suggest it becomes something much sharper. It corrects modern assumptions.
It exposes the background operating system that we didn't even know was running.
And the commentaries stress that this exposure, much like the severe rebuke given to the Laodiceans, is framed in the text as an act of correction meant to awaken the reader from delusion.
That is a very weighty way to look at it.
It really shifts the entire perspective.
So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final reflection to mull over on your own based on the sources we reviewed today.
A provocative thought to take with you.
Right. We talked earlier about how the Laodiceans were entirely blind to their own bankruptcy because their local culture, their massive banks, their famous textiles, their medical schools assured them they were thriving.
They thought their operating system was flawless.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, they really did. Look at your own life and the assumptions you bring to the table. What specific part of your modern worldview feels so obviously right and normal to you today, but might actually be the exact software glitch preventing you from hearing what these ancient texts are really saying?
Are you willing to examine the assumptions you didn't even know you had?
It's a tough question. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep reading and keep questioning the background programs you bring to the text.